Get out of this store. People like you can't afford a single thing in here. The voice of the dealership manager, Brenda Wilson, sliced through the showroom's quiet elegance. Two security guards flanked a well-dressed black woman, escorting her toward the towering glass doors of Beverly Hills' most prestigious Mercedes dealership. She didn't struggle. She didn't raise her voice. She simply walked, head held high, her designer handbag clutched in a steady hand, as every eye in the luxury showroom followed her every move. Behind a polished marble counter, Brenda Wilson stood with her arms crossed, a smirk of satisfaction playing on her lips. She had, in her mind, protected her high-end establishment from another person who simply didn't belong. Watching the glass doors swing shut, she felt the familiar sense of a problem solved. She turned to her staff, her voice carrying the weight of practiced authority. "We have standards to maintain. This isn't a charity." What Brenda didn't know was that she had just made the most catastrophic mistake of her career. Because 7 minutes later, those same security guards would be escorting her out of the dealership, her career in the automotive industry finished forever. 7 minutes. That's all it took for justice to walk back through those glass doors and shatter the world Brenda thought she controlled. The woman she had dismissed wasn't just another customer to be judged by the color of her skin. She wasn't someone whose worth could be measured by a condescending glance. The woman was Stephanie Thompson, and at 45 years old, she was the CEO and owner of Thompson Automotive Group, an empire of 23 dealerships spanning 5 states. But you would never have guessed it that morning. Stephanie had arrived in a modest 2018 Honda Civic, a vehicle that seemed out of place in a lot filled with German luxury. For Stephanie, however, that Honda was more than just transportation. It was an anchor, a constant reminder of where she had come from. Growing up in Detroit, Stephanie knew struggle as an intimate companion. Her father, Marcus, was a mechanic who came home after 12-hour shifts with grease etched into the lines of his hands and exhaustion settled deep in his bones. Her mother, Diana, cleaned office buildings at night, the scent of chemical cleaners clinging to her clothes as she worked while the city slept. Stephanie remembered her parents counting pennies for school supplies, and the sting of wearing shoes until the soles wore through. More than anything, she remembered the looks, the dismissive glances from people who saw her family as less than, as people who should be grateful for whatever scraps they were given. That little girl from Detroit had built an empire from a single small used car lot left to her by her grandfather. Everyone expected her to sell it. Instead, she poured her life into it, working 18-hour days, learning every facet of the business, and methodically building a legacy worth hundreds of millions. And that was precisely why she was here. Wilson Mercedes of Beverly Hills was her newest acquisition, purchased 3 weeks prior. The staff, however, remained blissfully unaware. This was Stephanie's mystery shop, a chance to see the unvarnished truth of the business she now owned. The dealership was a monument to prestige, its glass walls showcasing vehicles that cost more than most houses. From the outside, it was perfect. But Stephanie knew that the most beautiful facades often hide the ugliest truths. Running this location was Brenda Wilson, a woman who had also inherited her business from a grandfather. But there, the similarities ended. Third-generation wealth had given Brenda a sense of entitlement, not responsibility. She saw her position not as an opportunity to lift others, but as a throne from which to judge them. In a cruel twist of irony, Brenda, a woman in a male-dominated field, had adopted the very prejudices that had once sought to hold her back, treating people of color as threats to be managed, not customers to be served. Her leadership had created a toxic culture. Some of her staff were good people who had learned to keep their heads down, while others had fully embraced the discriminatory practices. Unsurprisingly, the dealership was failing. Sales were down and online reviews were abysmal. But Brenda blamed the market, the economy, anything but the face staring back at her in the mirror. When Stephanie walked in, dressed in professional but understated slacks and a simple blouse, the judgment was immediate. A white couple who entered just before her was swarmed by salespeople. Stephanie, meanwhile, was left to stand alone, met only with averted eyes and whispered remarks from behind the counter. They had already decided she didn't belong. From her glass-walled office overlooking the floor, Brenda watched with smug approval, muttering to her assistant about time wasters. Stephanie decided to test the waters. She approached a salesperson and inquired about the most expensive models. The response was a condescending suggestion that she might be more comfortable in the pre-owned section. When she persisted, asking about the $150,000 S-Class in the center of the showroom, the dismissal became sharper. Did she understand the cost? Perhaps something more practical was in order. None of them knew they were speaking to a woman who sold more cars in a month than their dealership sold in a year. They didn't know they were speaking to their new boss. And she was documenting every single slight. After 20 minutes of being treated like an inconvenience, Stephanie walked directly to the gleaming black S-Class, its flawless finish reflecting the cold, artificial lighting. She turned to the nearest salesperson. "I'd like to take it for a test drive." The request sent a ripple of disbelief across the showroom. The woman who couldn't possibly afford to be here now wanted to drive their centerpiece vehicle. That's when Brenda decided to intervene personally. She emerged from her office, her heels clicking in imperious rhythm on the marble floor. She approached Stephanie not with a welcome, but with a demand. "I'll need to see a credit report and proof of income before we can authorize a test drive." The hypocrisy was staggering. Just minutes earlier, Stephanie had watched the casually dressed white couple being handed the keys to a $200,000 AMG without being asked for so much as a driver's license. Stephanie calmly reached into her purse and produced a black premium business card, the Thompson Automotive Group commercial account, with a credit line that could buy the entire dealership outright. Brenda took the card, disappeared for 5 minutes, and returned with a look of manufactured regret. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice dripping with false sincerity. "Our system is down. We can't run credit checks right now. Perhaps you can come back another day." It was a blatant lie, a standard tactic for unwanted customers. Then came the final humiliation, delivered for the entire showroom to hear. "You know," Brenda said, her tone laced with condescending concern, "there's a very nice used car lot just down the street. You might be more comfortable there." The room fell silent. Other customers stared, a mixture of shock and morbid curiosity on their faces. The staff suddenly found their shoes incredibly interesting. In that moment, Stephanie felt a burning desire to reveal herself, to watch Brenda's smug expression crumble into panic. But she knew that the second she did, the performance would end. The truth of this place would be buried under a mountain of frantic apologies. So, she swallowed her pride, for the sake of a justice that was more important than her own dignity. It was then that a young saleswoman named Jennifer Martinez stepped forward. She was new and still believed customer service meant serving everyone. "Ma'am," she began, her voice a beacon of professionalism in a sea of hostility, "is there anything I can do to help you?" Brenda's reaction was swift and brutal. She pulled Jennifer aside and publicly berated her for wasting time on tire kickers. Jennifer's face flushed with shame as she looked at Stephanie with an apology in her eyes, trapped between her conscience and her paycheck. Watching from the finance office was Robert Chen. He knew this was wrong. As an Asian American man, he had felt the sting of prejudice himself. But with a mortgage to pay and a wife battling a serious illness, the risk of speaking up was too great. So, like always, he looked away and hated himself for it. But one person offered a silent gesture of solidarity. Marcus Williams, a mechanic from the service department, happened to be walking through the showroom. He was a black man who knew more about these cars than anyone on the sales floor. As his eyes met Stephanie's, a silent understanding passed between them, a shared recognition of a wearingly familiar experience. He couldn't speak, but his gaze was enough. The quiet moments of humanity made Brenda's next move all the more jarring. "I'd like to speak with the general manager," Stephanie stated, her voice even. A triumphant smile spread across Brenda's face. "You're speaking to her." With that, any pretense of professionalism vanished. Brenda's voice rose, accusing Stephanie of playing games, of being a troublemaker, of making her real customers uncomfortable. It was a tirade fueled by deep-seated prejudice, each word a confirmation of the rot within the dealership's core. Jennifer tried to intervene one last time, quietly suggesting they find a way to help. Brenda turned on her, threatening her with immediate termination for insubordination. The message was clear: conform or be cast out. Finally, Brenda Wilson played her last card. "If you don't leave immediately," she announced, her voice echoing in the silent room, "I will have security remove you." She walked to her office, picked up the phone, and made the call. As the guards approached, Stephanie made a choice. She could end this now with a single phone call, or she could see it through to its just conclusion. She chose justice. She gathered her purse and walked toward the glass doors, her dignity intact. As she passed Jennifer, she leaned in and whispered, "Sometimes the only way to fix a broken system is from the inside." The security cameras recorded it all. Stephanie being escorted out like a common criminal, Brenda's smug smile of victory, and the uncomfortable silence of the complicit. A few moments later, sitting in the driver's seat of her humble Honda Civic, Stephanie Thompson watched the dealership through her windshield. A plan was already forming in her mind. The humiliation was over. The reckoning was about to begin. For a moment, she let the full weight of the event settle upon her. The humiliation burned, sharp and cold. It was followed by a wave of anger, then the familiar frustration of being judged by the color of her skin rather than the content of her character. Then, with a deep, steadying breath, she reached for her phone and made the call that would change everything. Her assistant, Tom Bradley, answered on the first ring. Stephanie's first words told him all he needed to know. "Tom," she said, her voice a blade of calm determination. "It's worse than we thought. Initiate Protocol 7. Protocol 7 was the contingency Stephanie had prayed she would never use. It was the complete, systematic replacement of a dealership's management and staff. The final solution for a culture rotted beyond repair. It was the nuclear option, reserved for when discrimination was so deeply embedded that nothing short of raising the foundation and starting anew would suffice. Tom Bradley had been Stephanie's right-hand man for 8 years. He had watched her build an empire on intelligence, relentless work, and an unwavering respect for people. He had also seen her navigate the poisoned waters of boardrooms and business deals where men consistently underestimated her, but he had never heard this specific tone in her voice. This wasn't just business for Stephanie Thompson. This was personal. This was for every woman of color who had ever been made to feel she didn't belong. As Stephanie drove away from Wilson Mercedes, she knew that in a few short minutes she would walk back through those same glass doors. But when she returned, it would not be as the woman they had just dismissed. She would return as their boss, and Brenda Wilson's world was about to be torn from its orbit. 7 minutes. That's all it took for Stephanie's world to shift from humiliation to retribution. 7 minutes for Brenda Wilson's entire reality to crumble into dust. Brenda was still basking in the glow of her victory, riding the high of what she saw as another successful purge of an undesirable from her pristine showroom. Having returned to her glass-walled office, she settled into her leather chair, likely already composing the story she would tell her staff, a cautionary tale about maintaining standards and protecting their brand. That's when she noticed the black town car pulling into the lot. Tom Bradley stepped out, moving with the focused energy of a man on a mission. At 52, Tom had seen his boss face down prejudice before, but never with this level of public degradation. He was not alone. Behind him emerged 3 others, men and women in immaculate suits, carrying leather briefcases. They moved with the quiet authority that only comes from years of legal training and corporate power. This was Stephanie's legal team, summoned for one purpose: to execute Protocol 7. From her office, Brenda watched them approach, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach. Something about their purposeful stride and somber expression sent a warning signal through her mind. But Brenda Wilson had spent a lifetime wrapped in the armor of privilege. Her grandfather's name was on the building. Her family's influence stretched across Beverly Hills. In her world, people like her never faced real consequences. So, when Tom Bradley walked through the glass doors, her first instinct was annoyance. She sized them up as ambulance chasers, lawyers looking for a quick payday from a successful business. She had a standard procedure for this: let them make their threats, offer a token settlement, and carry on as before. She'd never lost a discrimination case because she was always careful to cover her tracks. But she had never dealt with Tom Bradley. He approached the reception desk with unshakable professionalism. "I'd like to speak with Brenda Wilson," he said, his voice steady. It was not a demand, but a simple request for a few minutes of her time. Brenda emerged from her office, her confidence a mask of contempt. She looked at Tom and his team, already planning her dismissal of whatever nonsense they were peddling. Tom wasted no time on pleasantries. He reached into his briefcase and withdrew a manila folder that would rewrite Brenda Wilson's life. It was thick, official, and stamped with corporate seals she recognized. He handed it to her with that same unnerving calm. The label read, Thompson Automotive Group, Change of Ownership. For a moment, Brenda stared at the words, unable to process them. Thompson Automotive Group. The name rang a distant bell, but she couldn't place it. Then she opened the folder. The first document was a purchase agreement dated 3 weeks prior. Wilson Mercedes of Beverly Hills had been acquired by Thompson Automotive Group for $47 million. The transaction was complete. Ownership had officially transferred. Brenda's hands began to shake as she flipped through page after page of legal documentation, financing records, board resolutions, transfer deeds, all bearing signatures and seals that confirmed this was no elaborate fraud. But it was the final page that made her blood run cold. There, in clear black ink, was the signature of the new owner, Stephanie Thompson, Chief Executive Officer, Thompson Automotive Group. The woman she had just humiliated, the woman she had thrown out of her dealership, was her new boss. Brenda's face went through a rapid, violent transformation. Arrogance melted into confusion, then disbelief, and finally, a wave of pure terror washed over her as the full weight of her actions crashed down. While she stood there, paralyzed, the glass doors opened once again. Stephanie Thompson walked back into the showroom. Gone was the woman who had been treated like an intruder. Gone was the customer who had swallowed her pride in the face of bigotry. This was Stephanie Thompson, CEO, a woman who owned 23 dealerships and employed over 800 people. Her posture was different now, her walk commanding attention. Her very presence seemed to suck the air out of the room, and everyone fell silent. She walked directly to Brenda, who was still clutching the ownership documents. Every customer stopped talking. Every staff member froze. Stephanie looked Brenda Wilson directly in the eyes. When she spoke, her voice was crystal clear, carrying across the silent showroom. "Ms. Wilson," she said, "I believe we've met. You have 7 minutes to clear out your office." The reaction was electric. Jennifer Martinez, the young saleswoman who had tried to help Stephanie, stood behind the reception desk, her mouth agape. Robert Chen, the finance manager who had watched it all happen and said nothing, felt his stomach plummet. And Marcus Williams, the black mechanic who had shared a knowing, weary look with Stephanie, allowed a small, satisfied smile to touch his lips. Justice, it seemed, had finally arrived. The other customers, who had watched Stephanie's humiliation in silence, now scrambled to distance themselves from the unfolding drama. Suddenly, they remembered urgent appointments elsewhere. A few had the decency to look ashamed, but most were simply afraid of being associated with the fallout. Brenda Wilson, however, was only staring at the woman she had called a troublemaker, the woman she had told to go to a used car lot. That woman was now her boss, and Brenda's career was over. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been inverted with breathtaking speed. Stephanie didn't gloat. She simply stood there with the quiet authority of someone who had been underestimated her entire life and had learned to turn it into her greatest strength. 7 minutes. 7 minutes to pack up a career built on prejudice. 7 minutes for Brenda Wilson to learn that actions have consequences. Those 7 minutes became the most pathetic display of damage control imaginable. Instead of accepting her fate, Brenda chose to fight not with dignity, but with the frantic desperation of someone who had never been held accountable for anything. Standing before her staff, she pointed a trembling finger at Stephanie and shrieked that she would file the biggest discrimination lawsuit in automotive history. The irony was staggering. The woman who had just orchestrated a textbook case of racial profiling was now claiming to be its victim. Her voice rose, cracking with hysteria. She claimed it was reverse racism, that she was being targeted for being white. She insisted her actions were standard business practice, that Stephanie had been acting suspiciously, and any reasonable manager would have done the same. But Stephanie had been preparing for this moment. Without a word, she raised her phone. Her security team had already accessed the dealership's surveillance system. What Brenda didn't know was that her entire performance had been captured in high-definition video and audio. Stephanie pressed play. The footage showed everything. Stephanie entering and being ignored, Brenda watching from her office making dismissive gestures, the condescending tone, the demands for a credit check that were not made of other customers. But most damning of all was the audio. The dealership's crystal-clear sound recording captured every one of Brenda's words, her comments about those people, Her threats against Jennifer, her sneering dismissal of a customer for the crime of being black in a luxury car dealership. When the video showed Stephanie being escorted out by security, a hush fell over the showroom. Stephanie let it play to the very end. Then she looked up. "This footage," she said, her voice cutting through the silence, "tells a different story." Brenda's face went white. She switched tactics, the threats vanishing, replaced by a gush of manufactured remorse. It was a misunderstanding. She was having a bad day. She was sorry if Stephanie had felt uncomfortable. She even tried to blame her own staff, suggesting they had advised her poorly. It was a pathetic, groveling display. Stephanie held up a hand, silencing the rambling apology. "This isn't about revenge," she said, her voice filled with an unmistakable authority that resonated through the room. "This is about accountability." The words struck Brenda like a physical blow. Stephanie continued, addressing everyone who had witnessed the day's events. She explained that discrimination wasn't just morally wrong, it was bad for business. It created a toxic culture that poisoned everything it touched. Brenda's behavior hadn't just hurt one customer. It had created an environment where good employees were punished for doing the right thing and countless others were driven away. This wasn't punishment for punishment's sake. It was about creating change. With Brenda's fate sealed, Stephanie turned her attention to the staff. She called Jennifer Martinez forward. The young saleswoman approached nervously, but Stephanie smiled. "Jennifer," she said, "I watched you try to do the right thing, even when it put your job at risk. That's the kind of leadership this dealership needs. I'm promoting you to sales manager, effective immediately." The shock on Jennifer's face was a sight to behold. In 2 hours, she had gone from a new hire facing termination to the manager of a luxury car dealership. Next, Stephanie addressed Robert Chen, the finance manager who had stayed silent. He approached with his head down. Stephanie acknowledged that while his silence was a choice, she also understood the pressure to conform. He would keep his job, but on one condition. He would undergo comprehensive diversity training and would be held personally accountable for fostering an inclusive environment. It was a second chance, but one that came with clear expectations. Finally, she turned toward the service bay and called for Marcus Williams, the mechanic who had met her eyes with a look of shared understanding. A very different kind of conversation was waiting for him. During her time in the dealership, Stephanie had taken note of Marcus. She had seen the flicker of recognition in his eyes and admired the quiet professionalism he maintained, even in an environment where his race made him a target for the very discrimination she had just faced. Now, Marcus was being offered a promotion to service manager. It was a position that would grant him authority over the dealership's technical operations, placing him in a leadership role where his deep experience and unwavering integrity could finally make a difference. For a man who had spent years keeping his head down, doing excellent work while injustice unfolded around him, this promotion was more than a new title. It was validation, a quiet promise that competence and character could, at last, triumph over politics and prejudice. But Stephanie's vision extended far beyond individual promotions. She gathered everyone in the showroom, salespeople, finance staff, service technicians, and administrative workers alike. In the silence that followed Brenda Wilson's departure, Stephanie delivered a speech that would become the founding document of a new culture. Her message was unequivocal. Discrimination of any kind would be met with immediate termination. She redefined customer service not as a sales tactic, but as a core principle of treating every person who walked through their doors with dignity and respect, regardless of race, gender, age, or appearance. She laid out new, transparent policies for credit checks and test drives, ensuring equal treatment for all. She established clear procedures for reporting discriminatory behavior, with ironclad protections for those who spoke up. Most importantly, she made it clear that this cultural shift was not optional. It was not a suggestion or a distant goal. It was the new reality, and anyone unable to adapt would find themselves elsewhere. Those who had enabled the morning's ugliness were informed they would face individual meetings to determine their future. For some, there would be retraining and a second chance. For others, their employment would end alongside Brenda's. The message resonated through the silent showroom. The toxic culture that had defined this dealership was over, and accountability applied to everyone. With Brenda Wilson gone, Stephanie shared her own story. She spoke of growing up in Detroit, of parents working multiple jobs, of the subtle and overt discrimination she had faced throughout her career. But she spoke not of grievance, but of purpose. She explained her choice to build the Thompson Automotive Group not just as a business, but as a testament to the idea that true success is measured by how many people you can lift up. For Jennifer Martinez, the young saleswoman who had been threatened for simply doing her job, the words were like rain on parched earth. Now, as the newly promoted sales manager, she was being handed the opportunity to cultivate the very workplace she had always dreamed of. The transformation was tested almost immediately. The same customer who had witnessed Stephanie's humiliation earlier that day walked back into the showroom. Without a moment's hesitation, Stephanie approached him herself. She introduced herself as the new owner and asked, with genuine warmth, how she could help. The man was visibly stunned, recognizing the very woman he had seen escorted out by security. Yet Stephanie treated him with absolute professionalism, her expertise and courtesy shining as she showed him vehicles and answered his questions. When he expressed interest in the very S-Class Mercedes she had been denied, Stephanie personally handed him the keys for a test drive. The woman who had been told she didn't belong was now the one granting access. The sale was completed in under 2 hours, the first transaction under new management, conducted with the principles that would define the dealership's future. As the day drew to a close, Stephanie reflected on the whirlwind of events. Success isn't about proving others wrong, she shared, capturing the essence of her philosophy. It's about creating spaces where everyone can prove themselves right. This was never about revenge. It was about building a world where talent could flourish, where character mattered more than connections. That evening, Stephanie drove away in the same S-Class Mercedes she had been refused that morning. But it wasn't a trophy of personal victory. It was a reminder of the responsibility that comes with power. Behind her, the dealership was already a different place. Jennifer was implementing new, equitable policies. Marcus was building a service department defined by excellence, free from prejudice. The showroom, once a stage for discrimination, now bustled with a diverse clientele and a hopeful staff. The Thompson Automotive Group would grow to operate 24 dealerships, each founded on the principles Stephanie embodied that day: equality, excellence, and the profound belief that everyone deserves a chance to prove their worth. Her greatest legacy wasn't in the cars she sold, but in the lives she changed, proving that one person's commitment to doing what is right can transform the world for everyone.